Thank you very much. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to talk to you all. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. I'm glad that you have drinks. That's excellent. So I'm going to talk about category theory and life. And I am going to present some basic concepts of category theory in case there are some people who don't know any category theory. But I'm going to show what I think may be some quite eye-opening examples from life, so that even if you know a lot of category theory, this may be some things that you haven't thought about, or at least you haven't thought about in quite this way. And in this way, I hope that there'll be something to appeal to everyone at all levels of category theory. Because I think that category theory is a way of thinking. And sometimes it can be presented as a lot of technicality, but it's a way of thinking, just like maths is a way of thinking. Oh, it's nice to say maths. I've trained myself to say math because I'm in America. Maths, maths. Maths is a way of thinking about science and the world, and category theory is a way of thinking about maths as well. So I'm going to show some things. Thank you for humoring me because I don't know any Haskell, really. My first introduction to Haskell was when I put up that first Catsters video just over 10 years ago, and it was called Monads 1. That was the first video, and then all these Haskell people appeared out of and I didn't know what it was or what they were or why they wanted to know about monads. So that was how I started seeing some things about Haskell. But since then, I've been to a few Haskell conferences and a few other functional programming conferences, and I don't understand much about it, but it amazes me to see kind of real applications. And someone says that they made their web page work more efficiently with some category theory, and I think, that's great. I have no idea how that could be, but if it is true, then that's fantastic. And the thing is that maths is often motivated by specific applications for solving problems, and that's not what motivates me, really. I always think that you have to have two reasons for doing something. There's the reason you do it. There's also the reason you don't stop. And for me, the reason I do category theory is because I think it's fantastic. The reason I don't stop is because I think it's useful. So if it weren't useful, then I would probably stop. And if I didn't like it, but it was useful, then I also wouldn't do it in the first place. So I think of it as a bit like a kind of Newton's law for brains. Anyway, the fact that it is also useful is a great bonus. But what I want to do is show that it's not just useful for specific applications and solving problems, but for clarifying how we think about things. And wouldn't it be better if more people in the world thought more clearly about things, especially at the moment? And in fact, I'm going more in that direction with my work. As some of you know, I am a category theorist. I was a sort of normal maths lecturer in a normal university, although I don't think there was ever anything totally normal about me. But I decided I wanted to reach more people in the world. And so I quit my job in Sheffield, which is where I was when I made the Catster videos, and I now work at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I teach art. No, I don't. I teach maths to art students. And I do lots of outreach work, and I go to schools, and I talk to teachers, and I do public events, and try to bring the message to as many people as possible that maths isn't just for mathematical people, that maths can help everybody think more clearly. And so my next book is about that, and it's going to be called Thinking Better: The Art of Logic in an Illogical World. So the plan for this talk is, first of all, to say a little bit about what category theory is. Then I will talk about some aspects of category theory. First of all, objects and morphisms. The principle of sameness inside category theory, because one of the main things category theory wants to do is have more subtle ways of saying when things are the same or not. Then universal properties, which is one of the key things category theory does. It tries to characterize things by the role they play rather than by their intrinsic, inherent characteristics. And then finally, I will talk about visual representation, because that's one of the important aspects of category theory. It's one that's sort of obvious because it's visual. You know, you think of category theory, probably you think of diagrams and stuff. But why are those diagrams there, and what are they other than just an acute aesthetic way of doing things? So first of all, what is category theory? Well, I like to say, and you may have heard me say this before, that category theory is the mathematics of mathematics. And in order to understand that, you have to understand what I think mathematics is. in the first place. Because of course maths isn't just about numbers and equations, and it's not about finding the right answer, and it's not about getting things right and wrong. I think that mathematics is the study of how things work. But it's not the study of how any old things work. It's the study of how logical things work. And it's not any old study of how logical things work. It's the logical study of how logical things work. And the trouble with that is that nothing works logically. I don't work logically. I'm sure even you don't work logically all the time. The computer doesn't work logically. You know, the Wi-Fi doesn't work logically. Nothing actually works logically. And so, as you know, in order to get things to work logically, we have to ignore some of the details that prevent things from working logically and move from the real world into the abstract world where everything does work logically. And the great thing about that is that everything works the way it's supposed to. The bad thing about it is that you can't win arguments by yelling. And so people who like winning arguments by yelling don't like the abstract world. But I actually don't like winning arguments by yelling. And I yell really loud. So if we unravel this, that means that category theory is the logical study of the logical study of how logical things work. Which might seem rather loopy. It might seem like it's gone a step too far, and some people, even mathematicians, say that category theory is too abstract. Or there's that awful thing that people say where it's abstract nonsense, and some category theorists have tried to reclaim that term to turn it into a good thing, but I don't like perpetuating the idea that there's anything nonsense about it. And what I'm going to argue is that the abstraction takes us a little further away, but the thing that we gain in the end is overview, context, and breadth. And if we're aiming for illumination, the idea is to illuminate a broader area so that we can see everything in context rather than just looking at the details. Of course, looking at the details is also important, and that's a separate thing. So, for example, in terms of the logical study of how logical things work, the London Tube map is one of my favorite examples of a logical diagram because it is not geographically accurate. But what it shows is the logical connections between stations, which is what we really need when we're on the tube. We don't actually need to know what direction the tunnel is going on when we're on the train. So I don't know if you've seen a geographical tube map, but this is a geographical tube map. It is, I think, not very easy to see what's going on. But it depends what you're interested in. If you're just interested in understanding how London fits together, then maybe that is interesting. So it's not to say that one thing is better than the other. And I don't think it's useful to say that abstraction is better than this or to pit things in competition with each other all the time, but rather to understand what are the advantages of some things and when we should use one thing as opposed to using another. So personally, when I'm actually taking the tube, I'd much rather use the logical tube map. This is quite nice to look at, though. So here is a family tree from some emperor or other that is another kind of category theory concept, because all you're doing is you're isolating particular types of relationships between people and just showing those relationships. So you pick a type of relationship and focus on it, and you're not saying that that's the only relationship between these people, and you're not saying that it's the most important one either. You're just saying, okay, for this situation, the thing I want to study is these relationships between objects. And then you can make a diagram of that. So this is what category theory does. It says, I'm going to focus on relationships between things and see what I can understand about a situation by just focusing on that for now. It's not trying to say that this is how everything in the entire world can be understood, any more than maths is trying to say maths is how everything in the entire world can be understood. No, it's a point of view that illuminates a particular aspect of the situation. So the way it does it is by having objects and morphisms. In set theory, sets just have elements and they just kind of sit there, whereas in category theory, there are objects and also some type of relationship between them that you've decided you're going to care about for now. And again, things can fit into lots of different categories depending on what you care about in different moments. But what category theory says is, actually, we can understand a lot about the objects just by thinking about their relationships with each other. Just like if you're studying a person and writing their biography, it would be quite odd to write a sheer character analysis of that person without ever mentioning their relationships with their family, their partners, their children, their friends, other people, and all those things. Whereas if you look at all of their interactions with different types of people, you can understand a lot about someone's character just by looking at those interactions. And that's what category theory does. And it does it using objects and morphisms. So this is a formalism that is extremely flexible. So you have a couple of objects and a morphism between them, and that morphism can be basically anything. So it could be an actual map, it could be a process, it could be an operation, it could be a transformation, or it could be a relation. It can be nothing to do with any of those things, just something that has some kind of thing that can be regarded as an input and something that can be regarded as an output. And we can, bless you, we can take it to be an actual relationship if we want to. So for example, it could be A is the mother of B. And then we could stick another one on afterwards and say B is the mother of C. And then we get composition of arrows, which is a generalization of the transitivity property of relations. But it's a bit more nuanced than that. Because if we were looking at transitivity, we would say A is the mother of B and B is the mother of C. Is A the mother of C? And the answer is no. And so this doesn't satisfy transitivity, but A is still something in relation to C, and that is the grandmother. And this is how we compose things in a category. We say we don't necessarily want there to be the same relationship between things, but we want to somehow be able to compile relationships after relationships to make bigger relationships. So as another example, you could have A is the sister of B, and B is the mother of C, and that composes to be the aunt. And what composition in a category tells us is that we can omit any arrows that we can deduce from the situation. So we can deduce in the top one that A is the grandmother of C, so we don't exactly need to say it. And that's why in a family tree, we don't tend to draw the relationships between grandmothers. And we don't tend to draw a relationship directly from an aunt to a child, because we can deduce it from something else. So these things become things that we can deduce and therefore omit to clear up the situation a little bit. So a category consists of some objects, some morphisms or arrows between them, a way of composing them, identities just saying that everything is the same as itself, and associativity and unit laws. So we can understand associativity in terms of family trees as well, because you can say if A is the mother of B and B is the mother of C and C is the mother of D, there are two ways that you can compose this step by step. You can go, oh, well, A is the grandmother of C, and if A is the grandmother of C and C is the mother of D, then that makes A the great-grandmother of D. But you could also go the other way around and say, oh, well, B is the grandmother of D, and that means that A is the great-grandmother of D as well. It comes to the same thing. And so in this case, associativity is saying the grandmother of my mother is the mother of my grandmother. We can also look at commutative squares in terms of this. So commutative squares are a common thing that comes up in category theory, and if you show a mathematician a square of arrows, they'll go, oh, that's category theory, possibly, or they won't admit that they're doing category theory because they're resistant to it. But many mathematicians are doing category theory even if they don't realize it, just like people in the world are often doing maths when they don't realize it. They think that maths is multiplying large numbers together. And so as long as they're not multiplying large numbers together, they think they're not doing maths. But they probably are doing it in some other ways. Just like every time you take the tube, you're kind of doing maths at some level. So commutative squares, you could say, well, so how about, this is a situation that of some of my parents' friends when I was young, and it really intrigued me. It was because two brothers married two sisters. And then they had children, and then there's a kind of different relationships between them. And it was really category theory. That was before I knew what that was. But so A is the brother of B and C is the sister of D. And the brothers marry the sisters. And so then you can ask yourself what the relationship is from A to D. So A is the brother of the husband of D, but A is also the husband of the sister of D. And in English, we call both of those things brother-in-law, but they're slightly different. So then there's a question, do you want to count those as the same relationship or not? And then an element of choice starts arising, because then you get to decide whether some things count as the same. And we're going to come to that in a moment, that there's a lot more choice in maths than people like to realize. And category theory gives you a framework for making those choices. It doesn't tell you what choices to make, but it makes it clear. It emphasizes which ones you are making, and it gives you a way of being clear about which ones you're making. So here is another example where the categorical approach it pulls out some structure from a situation that then becomes clearer. So we can just think about factors of 30, and the factors of 30 are 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 10, 15, and 30. So it's a bunch of numbers in a straight line. It's not very interesting. We do live in a three-dimensional physical world, which means we write on two-dimensional pieces of paper in one-dimensional straight lines. And there's a lot of accidental stuff that happens because we've forced everything to be in a straight line. Whereas things want to have natural geometry in some higher dimension. And I would say that because I'm a higher dimensional category theorist. But it's also why I don't like tidying my desk, because my papers have natural geometry in 3 dimensions. They don't want to go in a straight line. So I'm going to find some natural geometry in this situation by also looking at which numbers are factors of each other and drawing something like a family tree to show which ones are factors of each other. And like in a family tree, I'm not going to draw things across 2 generations. So if something is a composite of 2 arrows, I'm going to leave it out. So 30 is the kind of great-grandparent at the top. And 6, 10, and 15 go into 30 directly with nothing in between. 5 goes into 10 and 15. 2 goes into 6 and 10. 3 goes into 6 and 15. And 1 goes into 2, 3, and 5. So now we see it's the vertices of a cube, which I think is much more interesting than a bunch of numbers in a straight line. And we can think about why this happened, because as mathematicians and category theorists, we really like asking why all the time. I'm basically that 2-year-old who never stopped asking why, and why, and why, and whenever someone gives me an answer, I ask why again. So why does this happen? Well, it's to do with the prime factors of 30. So if you see that these numbers at the bottom are the prime factors, these ones are products of 2 factors, and this is a product of 3 factors, and then you can extrapolate that and go, oh, 1 is a product of 0 factors. So if you multiply no numbers together, you get 1. Does that make sense? Well, it does, because it's the extrapolation. So what I've done is I've broken it down into the prime factors of things. And now we see it's just like taking subsets of this set of 3 numbers. So this is all the subsets, where now these lines or arrows aren't factors. It's not this. Here they're saying is a factor of. Here it's saying is a subset of. And so if you multiply them together, that transfers you back to this diagram. So now we can go one level more abstract and say this will work if we take a set of any 3 elements. So we could take A, B, and C, and that would give us this diagram. And then, having become more abstract, we can then apply that to more things. So the point of going more abstract is it takes us further away, but because it's taken us further away, we can now actually get access to more things than we had at the beginning. For example, we could do factors of 42. It will become clear why this is interesting at all. So the factors of 42 are 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 14, 21, and 42. And now if we draw the diagram, something slightly curious happens, which is that 2, 3, and 7 are the prime factors that we're putting at the bottom. And they're not the smallest numbers anymore. So 6, 14, and 21 are at the level above, but 6 is smaller than 7. So we can express it using the prime factors again. And the thing I want to emphasize is that 6 is smaller than 7, but in this lattice, which you might recognize as a partially ordered set, 6 is at a higher level than 7. It's not directly comparable, but we've got 2 things going on in the numbers here. We've got an ordering according to which things are factors of each other, and then we're ordering things according to how many distinct prime factors, or how many prime factors they have. But there's also just the size of numbers. That's a different ordering, and they don't match up. So according to the size of numbers, you can have something down here which is actually bigger than up here. But according to this lattice of subsets, this one has more things in it than that one. And this is the key in my next example of this, where I've gone more abstract, and I can now apply this to types of privilege in the world. So if A, B, and C are now rich, white, and male, then we get a lattice of privilege, because here we have rich, white people who aren't male. rich male, white male, rich white male, and the empty set. So if we now fill in the things that aren't those, here we have rich white non-males. Here we have rich non-white males. Here we have poor white males. Then we have rich non-white non-males, poor white non-males, poor non-white males, and then at the bottom, poor non-white non-males. Now, the first aspect of this lattice that I want to emphasize is that according to the number of types of privilege, some things aren't comparable to each other. So these things aren't comparable. You can only compare things directly down the lines. So white privilege doesn't mean that all white people are better off than all non-white people. It just means that if you move from white down a line to non-white, then you're worse off. So any white person, if they weren't white, would be worse off if everything else were the same. That's what white privilege means. So the next thing I want to emphasize is that this is only the logic inside the situation. There is a place where the logic and the maths of the situation ends and it turns into sociology and politics. And the part where it turns into sociology and politics is the same part where in the factors of 42 we stepped out of it again and said, oh, but wait, 7 is bigger than 6 as a number, because some of these types of privilege outweigh others. And so if we look along this level here where each one has 2 types of privilege, I expect we can all agree that rich white women are actually better off than poor white men. And I think this gives us a clue to why poor white men in the world at the moment are particularly angry, because they're considered to be at this high level of privilege, whereas in actual fact, in absolute terms of privilege, they're the worst off, perhaps, of this level, because wealth can outweigh all other types of privilege. So we could redraw this diagram without changing the logic, but we could change the visuals of it by just putting that one up a bit and moving this one down a bit. And we could do the same on this level as well. And then let's think about this a bit harder, because what we have here is a rich, non-white, non-male. For example, Michelle Obama. Pretty privileged, probably much more privileged overall than poor white men. So actually this level probably goes higher even than that level. And so it's actually like this. And so we see it's not a cube, it's really a cuboid. And that I think the fact that these people who are logically on the level below are really in fact higher than these people, I think gives us a big something to think about why poor white men are so angry in the world at the moment. So that is the lattice of privilege. I'd now like to move on to the concept of sameness, which will lead us to questions about equality in the world. But sameness in category theory is very important, because we start with the idea that all equations are lies. So for example, 8 plus 1 equals 1 plus 8. No, it doesn't. 8 plus 1, if you're a child and you can only add up by counting on, 8 plus 1 is much easier than 1 plus 8. If you've ever tried doing this with children and you tell them 1 plus 8, they'll put 1 in their head and try and count on 8 and make a big mess. So also, 2 times 5 is the same as 5 times 2. Is it? If you have 2 bags of 5 chocolates in it and you're trying to give bags of chocolates as presents, that's very different from having 5 bags of 2 chocolates each. And how about this? 8 plus 5 is the same as 8 plus 5 plus 5. Is it? The one on the right's much easier. On the left, you have to do 8 add 5. That's really hard because it goes over 10. Whereas 5 add 5 is easy. You do 5 add 5 is 10, and then you can immediately add the 8 on without barely having to think about it. So these things are hiding something that is different about the left and the right. The answer is the same, but the process is different, and that's why they're useful. They're useful precisely because the left-hand side and the right-hand side are different from one point of view, but the same from another point of view, and therefore we can use the thing to pivot between 2 different points of view. So the only equation that isn't a lie is x equals x, and equations like it. So I should be a little bit less, I should stir things up less and say that all equations are lies or useless. Because this isn't a lie, but it is useless. And so what category theory does about this is it says there are lots of types of sameness, and we shouldn't just think about equality. We should think about when things count as the same, inside a particular context. And then we get access to more subtle things that we can say. So for example, for associativity, we think about two ways of adding things up, 4 plus 4 plus 2, and I like drawing these trees because, well, it's a natural geometry in higher dimensions than the straight line. Well, that's 10, and doing it the other way around, you do 4 plus 2 first, and you add 4, and that's still 10, because we know that numbers add up associatively, but that's because numbers are really boring. There's not much that numbers can do apart from be equal or not equal. Whereas when you study things that are more subtle than numbers, there are more things that they can do. For example, if you mix egg yolks and sugar together, and then you add milk and you heat it up, you get custard. Whereas if you mix sugar and milk together, and then you mix egg yolks in, you do not get custard. However, if you do this for cake, it doesn't really matter. So the cake recipe that I learned when I was growing up says cream the sugar and the butter together, then add the eggs, fold in the flour, and bake it, and you get cake. But it turns out that especially if you have an electric whisk or a blender, you can just kind of chuck everything in a bowl and go, wah. So the result is the same, but it kind of depends what you care about. So you get to choose whether it counts as the same or not. Because this way, it does rise better in general. And if you don't have an electric whisk, then mixing them all together is pretty difficult. So this way is the easiest way to do it if you don't have an electric whisk. So it depends what situation you're really in. Whereas the custard one, it's really not custard if you do it the other way around. It's not custard at all. So the key here is to think about what context you're in and use the relationships in that context to decide whether things count as the same or not. So this is the concept of isomorphism in a category. And it comes down to looking at invertible morphisms. So we can think about the process of adding 4. If we go add 4, well, we can invert that process because we can just subtract 4 again, and we'll get back to where we started. Whereas something like squaring is not so simple. If we square -3, then we could get back in, but it's not clear what process that is because square root gives us 2 possible answers. So this is less of an invertible process. And so in category theory, invertible things, we have F going one way and G coming back. And what we require is that if we compose in one starting at A and coming back again, we get the same as doing nothing. And if we start at B and come back again, we get the same as doing nothing. And in that case, A and B are called isomorphic. And the reason that this is a good relationship between those things, it's kind of the relationship that we have to have in category theory. Because in this case, the category cannot tell the difference between A and B. As far as the category is concerned, that is from the point of view of objects and morphisms, A and B are indistinguishable. So isomorphic objects are treated as the same by the rest of the category. It doesn't mean they are the same. So the one-element set containing the number 1 is isomorphic to the one-element set containing the number 2. So as far as the category of sets is concerned, they are indistinguishable, and you can use them for exactly the same purposes because it's just an element with a name. Of course, the set containing the number 1 is not the same set as the set containing the number 2, but that involves looking inside the object at their intrinsic characteristics, which the category can't see. So this is why the category can't see the difference. If you have this situation with isomorphisms, and you have some other object X that's kind of looking at A, then what does it see about B? Well, it can always compose the arrow with F, and it will produce an arrow to B. And when it's looking at B, it can compose it with G, and it will see the arrow A. So it will see exactly the same things about A as it does about B. So things can be isomorphic in one category, but not another. Whereas things can't be equal in one place and not another. They're just equal or they're not equal. Whereas this gives us a way of saying, okay, in this context, when we're thinking about this type of relationship, these things will count as the same, even though they're not the same. And then if we move to this other context where we're interested in some other relationships, these things will not count as the same. And that doesn't mean that they are or are not the same. It means that sameness is relative to context. And category theory kind of says everything is relative to context, and therefore we should always be aware what context we're working in, because nothing is absolute. So for example, here's an example. Have you ever tried freezing an egg? You might think, so when you freeze things, it's sometimes invertible and it sometimes isn't. So if you freeze water and thaw it, that's kind of okay. And if you freeze butter and thaw it, that's more or less okay. If you freeze milk and thaw it, it sort of depends how homogenized your milk was. Because if it wasn't, then when you thaw it, it will look really disgusting, kind of like vomit. So if you freeze an egg and thaw it, something very curious happens. So if you freeze it and thaw it and then crack it open and put it in a bowl, it looks like this. And I'm just going to zoom in. The yolk, the white goes back to normal, and the yolk kind of sits there. It's really strange. The first time I did this was entirely by accident because I was going away and I'd forgotten to use up all my eggs, so I just kind of bunged them in the freezer and hoped for the best. And when I came back, this happened. It's really freaky. If you cut it open, it actually looks boiled. I do not know why this happens. Yeah. The proteins will be denatured. That's why it happens. I now know why that happens. Thank you. And so the thing is, it's not actually the same. Or is it? Because actually, I spend quite a lot of my life eating egg whites. And so I quite often need to separate, and I throw away the yolks because I don't want to eat all the yolks because I'll get fat. And so if I want to separate them, this is actually equivalent because I'm only interested in the white. It's actually better because it's much easier to separate. You can just pick up the yolk and chuck it away. So it really depends. It really depends what you're interested in. So to some people, this is terrible, and I quite like it. Also, it's fantastic. It's so bizarre. Anyway, sometimes things are intriguing just because they're bizarre. Yeah?
Does that work for making meringue?
The whites afterwards, no. You can't freeze and thaw egg whites and make good meringue, but you can make an omelette. So whole categories can be isomorphic as well, which means that you map the whole category to the other category and the whole one back. So here's an important example. If we think about the position of privilege that male people have over female people, we get a little tiny lattice with an arrow from male people to female people. And this is isomorphic to the one where we have white people privileged over black people and rich people privileged over poor people. This is not the case if you try to compare male people and the difference between male and female people with the difference between female people and male people. And this is why sexism by female people against male people does exist, and it is bad, but it is not the same as sexism of male people against female people because of the overall hierarchy of the lattice of privilege. So equality doesn't mean that things are the same. Doesn't mean that in life, equality doesn't mean men and women are the same. It's a question about when the world should treat them as the same. And it's also not a question of saying they should always treat them the same, because physiologically we're different, so we need different types of medical treatment. That doesn't mean we should always be treated the same, but in certain situations, those differences are not the differences, they're not relationships that are interesting to the context that we're in. And so if we're evaluating a piece of mathematics, then our reproductive organs are not a relevant piece of information about the mathematics. Moving on to universal properties. Universal properties are about when things are kind of the best or the worst in a situation, or the biggest or the smallest, or something like that. And it's about characterizing things by the role they play in a context rather than their intrinsic characteristics. So category theory loves characterizing things by a universal property, because once you've done that, then you can go around looking in other categories for things that play equivalent roles. And the thing that you have pinned down by that property is unique up to isomorphism. So everything can only be unique up to isomorphism because the category can't tell the difference between isomorphic things. So for example, in this situation, the male people, the white people, and the rich people are playing the same role. And in this situation, 30, 42, and rich white men are playing the same role. So how do we formalize that? Often in category theory, we start with a feeling that something is going on that's the same, and then we say, okay, how can we formalize that? Just like what we do with maths. When we look at something in the world and go, this situation seems to be the same as this situation, what is it about it that's the same? If I take 2 apples and 2 apples, I get 4 apples. If I take 2 chairs and 2 chairs, I get 4 chairs. If I take 2 monkeys and 2 other monkeys, I get 4 monkeys. Something's going on the same. I'm going to extract the part that's the same, take it seriously as a concept in its own right, and that's how we get numbers. So universal properties is one of those things. When I didn't study category theory till I was a master's student, I wasn't one of these prodigies that as a first-year undergraduate starts reading Maclean. But when I did take my category theory in part 3, I realized that it was actually a prerequisite for my undergraduate degree, and that only after I did that did I understand everything that was going on in my undergraduate degree. Because all the things that had seemed to be the same in all these different courses were all because of some universal property in category theory. So the basic universal property, and all universal properties are an example of this one, is initial objects. So an initial object in a category is an object I such that for any object X, there is a unique morphism from I to X, which kind of means that the object I is at the beginning. All morphisms emanate out from it. So if all morphisms emanate out from it, that's weakly initial. But more than that, the morphism from I to anything else has to be unique, which means that everything is kind of pinned down in relation to the initial object. So for example, in these categories, the people in red are initial. And in these categories, the objects in red are initial. So something can be universal in one category and not universal in another. For example, if we look at our lattice of privilege again, then the rich white men are initial here. If we count the arrows as going down this way, then there is a unique arrow from here to everyone else. You might think that there are 2 arrows to the poor white non-males, but this diagram commutes, and so there is actually only 1 arrow going straight down the middle. So if we then focus on a small subpart of this diagram, we could just look at this part over here. And in this diagram, the rich white non-males are now the initial object in there, even though they weren't initial overall in this diagram. And so we could take another lattice of privilege where we only look at women, for example. So in this one, we have rich white cis women who are privileged over all the other types of women in this diagram. And so rich white cis women are extremely privileged among women. And this is why intersectionality causes so much excitement and pain at the moment. Mathematicians find the word intersectionality a bit difficult because it doesn't really resemble intersections in maths. But I think it's about the fact that if you restrict your attention to a different lattice, then somebody else becomes the most privileged. And then the people who are less privileged than those people can then feel hard done by when these people only emphasize the lattices in which they are lower down. But it's not that there is any absolute situation going down here. It's just about which particular lattice you are thinking about at any given moment. And what universal properties do for us is they say, we're going to look for the universal thing in this context, and we can now consider it relative to universal things in other contexts and think about other contexts in which it is not universal anymore. So finally, I'd like to talk about visual representation. I've done a lot of it throughout the talk already. I've drawn these diagrams that make things much clearer. If I had to describe that lattice of privilege in words, it would take a really long essay. And the essay would probably be more confusing than the picture. And I think that's why people are very confused about issues of privilege at the moment. Partly because it's confusing if you don't do these sorts of pictures, partly because people are stubborn, willful, arrogant, and bigoted. But that's a different issue. So visual representation is where category theory takes really seriously the arrows between objects and says, if we draw pictures using those arrows, we can now access a different part of our intuition than we could before. So we can now access visual and geometric intuition, and that's good, because when you move into the abstract world, one of the problems is you can't touch anything and you can't see anything. So you have to find ways to be able to relate it back to your intuition about the world. And so if we take the arrows really seriously, then it becomes a lot more like physical structures, and that's why these are called abstract structures, because we build the arrows up into abstract structures that look a bit like physical structures that we can then understand, just like the lattice of factors or privilege was a cube. And once you see it as a cube, you can look at the 3 dimensions of it as being moving along different types of privilege. You could then look at 4 types of privilege, and you would have a 4-dimensional cube, which is a little bit harder to understand, but it's not impossible. So, for example, you could draw a map of people who are friends with other people. And if I think that I'm very popular, then you can tell that I'm very popular because I'm here and I have lots of arrows coming out of me because I have lots of friends, whereas these people don't have very many friends. Whereas, if you have lots of arrows going in all directions, this is like having a little clique where everyone is friends with each other just as much. And then all the people in this is actually, there is a notion of clique in a category where everything is isomorphic to everything else uniquely. And it means that all of the people in here are kind of equivalent from the point of view of the category, which means it's like those cliques of people where if you tell a secret to one person, you just know that everyone else in that clique is going to know the secret. So this is a bit like flight maps. So if you look at, this is a Delta flight map. Just by looking at it, you can immediately see where the hubs are because they're the places that have most routes coming in and out of them. So I was quite surprised when I discovered, so Salt Lake City is a hub in the west here, but then what is that? That is, I can't see anymore, but it's something really surprising. It is Minneapolis. There's something surprising. And Memphis down here is I was a bit surprised that Memphis turned out to be such a hub. But then this is one way in which we can immediately see features of our situation. So I decided to analyze some political situations using the principles of category theory because I get very, very frustrated in the world at the moment, often. But especially when arguments happen where somebody says, oh, well, this is this person's fault. It really is that simple. And whenever someone says it really is that simple, it's never that simple. So there was the United incident when that guy was thrown off the plane and got injured on the way out. So some people said, well, it was his fault for not leaving the plane when he was told. It really is that simple. Well, is it that simple? So the writing is a bit small on here so that I could fit lots in. But the end result was that injury was caused to that person. Why was injury caused? Well, he refused to leave the plane, but also security used force on him. But also, they only used force because the airline called security in the first place. So actually, the reason injury was caused was because the airline called security and also security used force. Well, why did he refuse to leave? He needed to get to work. That was kind of valid. He was a doctor in a hospital. Are we going to blame him for that? Well, why did the airline even choose that person in the first place? There's a big question mark over that. Was it racism? Not clear. So also, they decided to kick people off. They didn't have to kick people off. They decided to kick people off. Why did they decide to kick people off? Well, nobody volunteered to leave. Why did nobody volunteer to leave? Well, the airline didn't offer them enough money. But also, they didn't take the money because they really wanted to get to where they were going more than the amount of money that was offered to them. And why did they decide to remove people in the first place? Well, the flight was too full. Why was the flight too full? And oh, well, also they needed crew in Louisville. Why did they need crew in Louisville? Why was the flight too full? Well, something to do with crew scheduling. What had gone wrong with their crew scheduling that they needed crew in Louisville that badly at that moment? And why was the flight too full? Well, we all know that flights get overbooked. Why do flights get overbooked? Flights get overbooked because people often miss flights. Why do people often miss flights? This is a huge web of interconnected factors. And if we try to declare that only one thing of these is the cause, then we have drastically oversimplified the situation. And you can see that each of these branches that is a beginning, I have decided is a root cause in this situation. Now, this doesn't mean that my analysis is correct, and it also doesn't mean that I can solve this problem. But what it does mean is that I am thinking more clearly about this problem, and the people say, oh, well, it really is that simple, when it really isn't. And I think that what category theory emphasizes is that the connections between things are what causes things to happen, not the intrinsic characteristics by themselves. So here's another one that is even more complicated, which is why I put on weight. I used to be quite fat. I'm trying not to be quite fat anymore. So people say, oh, well, it's really simple. You just have to eat less. Or people are fat because they eat too much. It really is that simple. You know, it really isn't that simple. So I gain weight because I take in more energy than I burn, which means that I eat too much and I exercise too little. But that only counts as too much and too little because my metabolism is at the rate it is. And guess what? My metabolism is very slow. Why? Because I eat too little and because I exercise too much. And the fact that I once had to lose 50 pounds by eating less and exercising more slowed my metabolism down. So my metabolism is also like that because of something to do with genetics. So some people say they're only fat because of genetics, and it really is that simple. But it really isn't that simple. So the amount of sleep you get and when you get it turns out to affect metabolism. And I don't want to admit that because I love depriving myself of sleep. But also, why do I eat too much? Okay, well, it's partly because I like food, but it's partly because I emotionally eat. Why do I emotionally eat? Some people, emotions don't cause them to eat too much at all. Well, it's partly because of my genetics and partly because of my upbringing. Food was something that you use to celebrate and soothe and all sorts of things. So, well, also, that's why I like food. Well, I also eat too much because of social pressure. People don't like it when you don't eat, and they love it when you eat a lot. But so social norms cause that social pressure, but they also cause the emotions that cause me to eat too much. But also time pressure causes those emotions, and it also makes me get less sleep. But time pressure also, oh, life. You see, I put on weight because of life. Time pressure causes me to exercise too little because I'm busy, and it also causes me to eat too many calories because the fastest food that's near to hand is usually something that's got more calories. But there's another reason I eat too much, which is the entire food industry. So the advertising, there's a multi-billion-dollar industry trying to get me to eat too much. And they're really good at it, and so they succeed. And the reason it's there is because they make money out of it, and this causes growing obesity rates. But that means that more of this advertising causes the growing obesity rates, but then they know they can make loads of money out of those people who are trying to lose weight. So then there's a final thing, which is that when I do gain weight, it makes me upset. Also, it makes me eat less and exercise more. And so there are these vicious circles everywhere. So now try telling me that it really is that simple. It really is not that simple. And so finally, here's something that really is not that simple. The election. I'm just going to leave that there, as they say. There are many things that caused the election to happen. One thing that often doesn't get taken into account is the voting system. And what I like to think is that this diagram is the logic and the maths inside what happened. And many people will say, what can a mathematician or a logician say about politics? Well, this diagram of interactions is the maths of the situation. Now, just like in the lattice of privilege, the lengths of the arrows and the weighting of them, that's not maths anymore. That's where politics and sociology take over. Why? Why was the social political climate that way in the first place? Why did politicians get out of touch? Why did people take these positions, and why did it cause people to think those things? That is somewhere in the boundary. There is a boundary between the maths of the situation and the politics of the situation. But I don't think that you can understand it without understanding the logic of the situation. But a lot of people are trying. And if you are not adept at being able to follow these long chains of arguments and understand these multiple interactions, then you will be liable to say, it's just because Hillary's evil. It really is that simple. It really isn't that simple. So I'd like to conclude by taking down this contentious slide and talking about some lessons from category theory. So first of all, everything should be understood in context. Everyone is privileged in some contexts and not others. And everything should be studied in relationship with other things, not in isolation. And in particular, when we're looking for causes of things, we shouldn't look at individual causes. We should look at how the system interacts with each other. And this was put wonderfully by Jessie Tron. I've got so used to her handle, I've forgotten her actual name. But what's her name? Jessica Care. Right, it rhymes with Care Bear. But it's spelt like Kerr. So Jessica Kerr said this at another functional programming conference I went to, that we should not think about things in isolation, but we should look at systems. And she may have been talking about programming, but this works in the whole world as well. Individuals aren't to blame. It's the way that the system makes things interact with each other that is to blame. And so, in final conclusion, I'd like to say that this has all been about abstraction, but it has actually been about the world around us as well. So abstraction takes us away from reality, but it casts a wider light on it. So I have an image that what we're doing is trying to shine light on things. And if you take a torch and shine light at something very close up, then you will have a very bright light, but a very, very small area will be illuminated. If you raise the torch up a bit, then the light that's cast will get wider and a bit dimmer, but you'll see more of the context around your situation. And the more you raise it up, the more context you will see and the less detail. So it really depends what you want. If you go too far back, then of course your torch won't have any effect anymore at all, so it will have defeated the purpose. So the key is to be able to move backwards and forwards. And when we do want to see context, then we do need abstraction to raise us up and cast a wide light on everything that we're trying to understand. Thank you.
I would like to argue a little bit about the last statement about abstraction takes us further from reality. I think abstraction creates reality as we see it. Mm-hmm. Like for instance, reality is the right abstraction level chosen by us. Like if I talk or if I listen to you, I don't see sound waves. I abstract from sound waves to words. Mm-hmm. So if I choose abstraction level too low, mm-hmm. I wouldn't hear words. I would just see just waveform.
Yes.
If I choose it too high, then I don't see anything. Just a point on the map or something. Mm-hmm.
So yes, it depends what you mean by reality. So it depends what you define as reality. A lot of people would say that sound waves aren't reality, that they're also some other kind of thing. But when I say reality here, I mean the what most people regard as reality, the reality that we interact with physically on a daily basis. But yeah, I do not have a rigorous definition of reality. And in fact, I don't think that abstract things are personally, I don't think abstract things are any less real than real things. Is anything real? I don't even know if I exist. Is anyone here convinced they exist? A couple of people.
No, press no, press no. Snooze.
Snooze?
Snooze, yeah.
Pick a time?
No, snooze. So I'm Simon Peyton-Jones. I loved your sort of connection between kind of abstract category theory and real life. I really like that. But just on this final slide, sort of lessons that we might draw, I would hope that abstraction kind of is empowering somehow. Mm-hmm. But yeah, if I summarize your final slide, it seems like saying it's complicated, and that feels very disempowering, disabling. I'm not sure what to do. Life is complicated. All those diagrams and nodes about the political situation, and maybe there should have been a lot more nodes. Let me take an example of when abstraction is empowering. Like, once I start to see register allocation as a graph coloring algorithm, which was a complete revelation to me when I first learned about it. That's amazing, because I can take a solution from one place and apply it in another. Have you got examples where you've found the kind of abstractions that you've been working with, where you could use them to do something useful in your life, if you see what I mean, to take something from one place and apply it somewhere else in a way that you never thought of?
Say that last part again.
Just
I missed the beginning of the question.
So rather than being disabling and saying, it's complicated.
So I don't think that
we
is
could say
disabling
enabling, because the abstraction lets me see more clearly and therefore do something I couldn't do before.
I do think that the abstraction has made me see more clearly. So I don't think that complicated is bad. And I think that one of the problems in the world at the moment is that people want things to be simple because they think that's better than it being complicated, which I don't think is the case. I think that you can oversimplify things and then you've lost something. Whereas if you understand all the connections between things, then that is a different kind of simplification. And it's not a loss of information. So abstraction, in a way, is forgetting details, but you're trying to forget details that are not relevant to this particular moment. Whereas if you forget details that are relevant, then that's more like a simplification than a simplification. So personally, I think that understanding all the interactions like that helps me to understand why people are disagreeing with each other so much, because it's about where they fit into the particular diagram. And it actually, the web of interactions makes a bridge then between the different people who disagree with each other, rather than the situation we have at the moment where arguments tend to push people further and further away from each other, instead of building any kind of bridge that encompasses everybody in the same system of interactions. That's why, to me, it is empowering and not depressing.
I understood his question in a different way, so I would like to try to rephrase it in my own words. It's not just about picking the right level of complexity or simplicity, but so much as finding patterns between different graphs that you're building. For example, using maybe something you learned in the process of trying to control your weight might apply also to trying to fix the problems that we encountered in the 2016 election. Like you mentioned, there are negative cycles that we encounter, right? And if we can figure out how to fix negative cycles when controlling our weight, maybe we can also fix negative cycles in politics, for example, too. So we can find patterns between the two.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And another thing is that if you see all the connections between things and then you weigh them up, you can decide which ones are the easiest to break. Because if you're trying to stop the outcome from happening, then you need to break some of those connections somewhere, including the negative cycles, but any of the connections that we need to break, yes.
So one of the things with category theory, I think, when some people try and learn it, is that it can seem very complex and it can seem very abstract, and people might be put off from learning it. And I was wondering, with the kind of relation of that as well to some of these problems in life where, like you say, they're more complex than people want them to be. There are maybe systemic issues rather than issues with individual persons or groups or things like that. And again, it seems that maybe people are struggling to solve those or come up with the right answer because they have a fear of that complexity and they don't want to understand those sort of hidden systemic causes. From your work kind of teaching category theory and trying to introduce people to it, do you think there's any particular ways that we should try and get people to not be afraid of complexity or to want to put the effort in to understand that logic behind the scenes?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. Obviously, education is an important key, and that's why I'm going around the world trying to get people to become more comfortable with mathematics in the first place. And because I strongly believe that mathematics is at the core of logical thinking, and that if you get used to levels of abstraction in maths, you have to work with them for a while to get used to them and move on to the next one. So being unafraid is partly to do with getting used to those things. Now, I tell people that they've all performed abstractions. We all have performed abstractions. We're so used to them that we often don't notice them. For example, the move from objects to numbers that we all did when we were very little is an abstraction. And if you've ever helped small children with that, which I have a lot, you see them struggling with the abstraction of moving from the objects that you're getting them to manipulate to the idea of numbers. And when they make that leap, they often, some of them don't, but mostly children make that leap and move on to the next thing. And then they hit some ceiling somewhere, often when the numbers turn into letters. That's a place. The time I remember getting really, really put out was when I learned that a one-object category is a monoid. That blew my brain out and took me a while to understand it. But helping people through those leaps of abstraction, because another thing that abstraction does is it enables us to package lots of things up into one unit so it doesn't seem complicated anymore. And so once you're used to a diagram of interactions, so that lattice of factors or privilege doesn't seem complicated to me because it's a single unit. So once you've packaged things up into a single unit, then you can manipulate it more easily because it's not so many things. Just like when you put your clothes, you pack your clothes in one of those vacuum bags that you use a vacuum cleaner to suck all the air out, then it's one unit. Right? That's just like when letters get strung together into words. If you're trying to memorize a poem and you don't know any of the words, then you just have to remember a whole load of letters and sounds, and that's really hard. But if you understand them as words, then you've packaged the little bits into single units, and it doesn't seem complex anymore. So I think one thing is to get used to those abstractions so that the complexity actually is reduced. And another is simply just to get fitter. So we shouldn't pretend that this doesn't require hard thought, and we should encourage people to embrace the hard thought. And if it is hard thought, that doesn't mean that it's bad or that you're bad at it. it means that it's something that is worth doing. Just like people have generally become more accustomed to the idea of going to the gym or keeping fit in some way and lifting weights. When I was young, I absolutely abhorred the notion of any kind of physical exertion. And then I got fat. And it was partly because of my experiences at school, where I was ridiculed for being terrible at sport. And I finally got over that and realized it was kind of good for me. And now I relish some forms of physical exertion, as long as it doesn't involve a ball. And so I think that people are starting to get the idea that intellectual exertion, it can be exhilarating and that is also good for us and important. And then people will stop resisting it and stop declaring proudly that they're bad at maths and things like that. And it's a big general process, and it needs to start with education at all levels, I think.
More questions?
Is there any interaction between what you're looking at from sort of category theory for understanding behaviours and game theory? Or has that possibility been explored?
Probably, yes. I don't really know enough game theory to say exactly what that would be. But seeing as category theory, there are two things I can say. One is that category theory is hovering around all of mathematics. The other is that lots of category theorists are also game theorists, so there must be something going on.
Any more?
Also, does it make it more complicated? Well, I guess it must do. But how do you consider if the relationships are dynamic, if they're constantly changing?
Oh, interesting. I don't know. I think you probably have to have a new category where those relationships aren't the morphisms anymore, but the morphisms and something else. I mean, there is category theory in dynamical systems, and I don't really know what that is, but it does sound like things are changing. They use it to study things like the weather. That's changing.
One of the great things about maths is you get to state and prove theorems.
Yes.
Have you found any examples where some theorems of category theory have applied in the kind of more broad applications that you've been describing?
I haven't exactly used any theorems, but there is one I like a lot, which is the Eugenia lemma. So the Eugenia lemma says that, if you know what the Eugenia lemma says, then what it says is that if something walks like a duck and talks like a duck, you might think it's a duck, but that's not enough. It has to be regarded as a duck by other ducks. And I think that somehow applies. But in the very serious technical sense, I would say at the moment, no. I'm not trying to directly apply theorems of category theory to life, partly because that is, I think, verging on crackpottery, and partly because I'm the kind of mathematician who isn't always focused on just theorems for solving things, but more on setting up frameworks for clarifying our way of thinking. So most of the category theory I do is setting up a framework for somebody else to do some thinking. And the theorems that I prove are theorems proving something coherent about the framework rather than solving some giant problem. So that tends to be my point of view on category theory.
Okay. One final question, perhaps? Otherwise?
I have a comment about the previous question.
Okay.
There is a whole branch of mathematics called, I think it's called social choice theory, which probably has some applications, and I imagine there's categories in there somewhere.
Yeah, so trying to combine the talk with the discussion, the panel discussion we had yesterday, perhaps we should all try tonight to draw a diagram about the foldable traversable proposal. But, let's thank Eugenia again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.